Ayrton and I, we're going to talk about security and privacy today. We're going to talk a little bit about how do we approach this topic in Microsoft, and try to give you some examples of operational, advice that we use, and some things that can help you also increase your posture in there. So who am I, and why am I talking about this thing? So my name is Agustín. I recently rejoined Business Central, and I'm leading one of the AI solutions, formerly known as application teams. But let's see, actually I've been 11 years at Microsoft. I was back in F&O for 3 years, another 5 years in Business Central before, and then I started like a little rock tour around the US. So I was working with the BAB team for another 3 years, and I used to be a security lead and responder of incidents. And I was also working on the privacy side of things. I did the implementation for GDPR for the internal data for Business Central. So let's start with what actually security means, right? It's the practice aimed at defending against cyber attacks, but most people stop thinking about security there. But there is a very important piece, which is actually mitigating their impact. Once you get something, when someone attacks you and you get inside, you have to minimize the pain. And that is one of the pieces that is more important. Actually, if you look at the picture in the right-hand side, that is the Cyber Defense Operations Center of Microsoft, and it's one of those fancy rooms with like screens all over the place and the news and all of that stuff. And the big piece of that room is that protect, detect, and respond. So protect is what most people think when they think about cybersecurity, but figuring out that something is wrong and you have someone inside is at least as important, and kicking them off afterwards is also massively important. So actually, this is what people used to think when they think about cybersecurity. We put a massive wall around the stuff that we want to protect, and we hope that no one gets in. The problem with that is that if there is a small hole somewhere in the wall, or someone finds a way to tunnel under your wall, then you're screwed. The keys of the kingdom are gone. So what we tend to do instead is what we call assume breach. Assume that someone is already inside, and then figure out how you're going to figure it out that they're inside, and figure out how you're going to kick them out, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, so now we've heard from Agustín and why he's here and what he's going to talk about, but perhaps you're wondering, who am I and why am I qualified to talk about any of this, right? So unlike Agustín, I never left Business Central. And in fact, some of you might remember me from previous years' talks about Power Platform, but now I have a new role where I'm working on Copilot experiences and Copilot chat. But in my spare work time, I'm the privacy SME for the client teams. So if anybody on, like with my colleagues, have questions about privacy issues, then I'm the person that they would go to find out the answers. Right? So let's talk about what privacy means. Security is all about protecting your data from bad actors, but privacy is all about how your data is handled by the people that you trust. And privacy and security problems often share the same solution. It's all just a matter of perspective. So there's going to be a lot of overlap of what we're talking about today from different angles. And so just a quick refresher, what do we mean by your data? Right? When I say your data, you're probably thinking about data that is about you, right? So that would be your name, your address, your contact information. Obviously, that's very personal to you. But it's also data that is created by you. So that would be like sensitive business information or credentials, or even the things that you type in as search queries. That's all information that was provided by you that is your personal private information. It also covers data which identifies you. So when you use the product, we're going to assign you a unique identifier so that we can track things like error messages and usage behavior in the product. And it's also all of the data that is linked to that identifier. And finally, data that is shared by you with Microsoft. So if you provide us feedback or you have conversations with our support engineers, then all of that information is also your own personal data and contains sensitive information about you. So how does Microsoft actually govern data privacy? How do we make sure that we follow the regulations? What are our internal policies? That's some of what we're going to talk about today. So I'm just going to go through each of these one by one. The first thing is, obviously, when you purchase a product from Microsoft, then you enter into a service agreement with Microsoft. And as you can see, the first thing in that service agreement is your privacy, right? And we detail the terms of the privacy agreement, all of the things that we're doing to protect your data. And it's the first thing in the list because we know that your data is important to you. And it's also very important to us. We want you to be able to trust us, and so we have all these policies, right? So there's also laws that we need to comply with. So the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, is an EU law which grants you certain rights regarding your data. So you have the right to be informed about and consent to what data is collected, why it's being used, and who is collecting that data, in this case, us. Right? And you also have the right to view, edit, delete, and export your data as well. So you have total control over what data we hold on your behalf. And so we need to comply with this law. And so the way that we usually do that is that you can view and edit your data and get a copy of it all just through the product, right? This is something that's a natural part of using the system. If you want to update your sales invoices or export your data from the database, you can do all of that through TAC or through the UI. And when you sign up to use Business Central, you have agreed to the terms of service and to the service agreement, which we laid out before, so we know that we've obtained your consent before you even log in. So most of these rights are taken care of just by the nature of the product itself. But there are some special conditions to this. So for example, if you've provisioned Business Central in a European environment and you have like a tenant that's based in Denmark, but your Power Platform environment is provisioned somewhere else, it's a perfectly valid setup, but in this case, we need to inform you that your data is going to be sent out of geographic boundaries. There might be other different compliance certifications that are required by some software and not others. And so when you use one of these features, you use one of these integrations, we need to get your informed consent. So we will show you a privacy notice, and you can't continue to use the feature until you've accepted this. And we keep a record of the fact that you've accepted that to cover ourselves and make sure that we are doing things in a compliant way. So speaking of GDPR, in 2020, there was a little bit of a change to how you would traditionally handle data with GDPR. Right? So there's a guy called Max Schrems who often goes to the European Court to fight on your behalf as users for your data privacy rights. And in 2020, there was a court ruling that the existing agreements where you would be able to transfer data from the EU to the US were actually in violation of GDPR because the US intelligence services have access to your personal data when it's based in the US. And so in order to combat that, Microsoft implemented the EU data boundary. And this is a Microsoft policy, right? It's not something that you'll find anywhere else. This is something that we have implemented to make your lives easier, right? So if you provision all of your services, so if you get Business Central and Power Platform and all of the other services that you've linked together in the European data boundary, which is, I've drawn it out on the screen, right? This is a map of all of the countries that are in the EUDB. Obviously, there are some countries that are in Europe that are not in this list, right? So this is the areas that are covered by this. And as a partner, when you provision all your services inside the EUDB, you can trust Microsoft to keep that data compliant with GDPR. So you only need to worry about your own solution. And finally, I want to talk about compliance certifications, right? So all of the products in the Business Central ecosystem, all of the business applications that we provide, and even Azure itself, are required to obtain privacy and security certifications. And so there's the ISO 27001, that's about security management systems. 27701 is about privacy management systems, and then SOC 2 is all about how you actually, secure the data and protect people's privacy. And so it covers broad areas. For example, encryption, obviously we want to protect your data from bad actors. Access control, so making sure that the right people do have access to your data. Data redundancy, so let's say that our data centers go down or some of your data is corrupted, then we need to be able to secure your data and ensure that we have a backup copy. Service availability, so if the service goes down, we still need to guarantee your GDPR rights. We still need to make sure that your business can continue to operate. So we need to make sure that the uptime is to a certain level. And then we need continuous monitoring, right? Because as great as we are, things will break and the service will go down, data centers will get corrupted. And so we need to make sure that we're aware of that and that we have an incident response plan so that we can, secure data as fast as possible. And so these certifications are awarded by third parties, right? We do all of the work and we provide the evidence, but somebody external to Microsoft needs to certify that we have satisfied all of these requirements. And so you can be sure that when you use Business Central, you're using an industry standard product, and we have all of the protections that you would expect in place.
Cool. So we talked a little bit about what security is and what privacy is. Now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the operational things we do in order to comply with those certifications or some of the internal processes that we follow. And I talked with one of the CVPs, corporate vice presidents from the response center that we talked earlier about, and he had this very cool quote that maybe it's not extremely quite specific, but I think it's a good way to think about this topic. He maintained that 50% of the fight of improving your security posture was about inventory and maintaining your assets. We'll dig down into that. The other 30-40% is about other security fundamentals like authentication, encryption, all of these things. And the last 10, around 10-20% is about just thinking about the customer perspective, be empathetic with your customer. And also, on the other side of the coin, think as an attacker. How can I get into my own systems? If I was trying to break in, how would I do that? So we'll take a look into that a little bit more. Let's see. Yeah, it's working. Cool. One thing, if you get one thing out of this, and we will go back into it, inventory your stuff. You cannot protect what you don't know it exists. And actually, we were doing an exercise a few years back. We were trying to do that attacker mindset that I was saying before. And the patient zero that we managed to actually break into some of our systems was a test machine that no one knew it existed for like 4 years. And we just kind of found it somewhere, and it happened to have some credentials, and that was the starting pivoting into the rest of the system. So really, really, really take a look at everything you own in the company, everything you're using, assets, software, licenses, whatever the heck it is, and write it down in a paper, in OneNote. It doesn't have to be anything too fancy. Just think about what you have, because everything else comes based on this, right? So this is a very massive improvement. Once you have that list and you know what you have, be very critical about what is in that list. Do I really need this thing? Can I actually, kill half of the VMs that are sitting down somewhere that no one is really using? As much as you can reduce attack surface, it's going to be much more difficult to get in. That we should have killed that machine, years back, right? And it was definitely a very big risk. So Marie Kondo your shit, if you can. Go through it, reduce, simplify, eliminate. Let's see. And once you have that, you know what, you have the minimum amount of machines, keep them all up to date. Pick up all of those annoying messages about updating your software, click yes, automate it if you can. There are some very cool tools like Winget in Windows or Mac Updater in Mac. Keep them up to date, because I don't know if you know, but this is a few years. Does any of you have seen this message before? I cannot see much the hands. Maybe we can do like a small. Okay, cool. So if you click no into that one, in that particular one, I don't know if you see, but in between the fix your mouse wheel, there is something that says fix CII hacking Notepad++ issue. That was a publicly available vulnerability released by WikiLeaks. So if you didn't press yes, suddenly your machine was probably compromised or potentially compromised. And not only that, but let's see. This is a few years back, but there was this very nice article about the NSA talking about the vulnerabilities that the state agents were using to get inside machines. Some of them were like many years back, right? This was 2020. This is one vulnerability in 2015, and was in the top 20 of vulnerabilities that were used to get into people's, remote execution, which is a very, very bad one. Cool, that's the 50% thing. So let's get that out of the way, and then let's jump into other fundamentals, right? Think about your story about access control. Think about who has access to things, who are you giving access to your internal machines, your internal privilege actions. Another one of these ones, who in here can actually push code into production just with your username and password? Too many people in here can access production resources in their regular machine, like the one they take home every day and they install WhatsApp on. Cool, so think about these things, because there is a bunch of, think about the different factors of authentication. When we're talking about passwords, it's something that you know, But now we are starting to be more and more familiar with things like, okay, I can authenticate with my phone, or I have a YubiKey or something to plug, or maybe I'm authenticating with my fingerprint or something like this. It's always great, and you heard this a lot, but multi-factor for the win, right? At least two-factor authentication everywhere. If you want to go crazy, go three-factor authentication, that also works, but two-factor will be great. If you can, like, a FIDO token, like a YubiKey, or an authenticator app, like the Microsoft or the Google app, whatever, just is going to increase your security a ton. If you can avoid it, avoid the SMS phone authentication. It's still way more secure than not having it, but it's probably the worst of this all. And lastly, there is also, like, if you don't know this website, Have I Been Pwned, is by Troy Hunt, which is a very, very cool security researcher, and it publishes all of the leaks of like passwords and breaches and everything like this, and you can set up some monitoring if you want and see if any of your passwords have been leaked into the internet. Yeah, so what I was saying now, right? Use an identity provider, try to go passwordless, try to set up a password manager. If you are writing code, you are like, put your secrets in a dedicated secret store. Don't put them in code, don't put them in a notepad file, just put them somewhere. And have a think about what are you gonna do if you have to rotate these secrets. If they get leaked, how are you gonna change them, especially in your production systems? But everyone can mess up on this, and that's what I'm saying. As many things that you have is better, because does anyone wanna guess what the password for the most wanted one of the most wanted cyber criminals for the FBI was?
You're not far off.
It was not far away. His cat name 123, actually. So his machine got taken by the FBI. He managed to lock it on time, but it didn't take them much to actually guess the password. So try to go to FA, try to do all of this extra stuff, because it's not. Everyone can mess up, so try to put the things in to avoid it. Very wordy slide, but just basically pipelines, just use tools for this, right? There is static analysis, there is dynamic analysis. Use things like CodeQL, or use CreditScan. Use a ton of, like, there's a very cool open source community for tools that check for vulnerabilities, like those ones that we saw before. Be very aggressive managing secrets, right? Do not put secrets in code. CreditScan is great, block people from putting credentials in code. And removing them from your code doesn't work because it's in your source control history. So that was one of the first things we were doing. We were trying to, break into our own systems, look for commits that says, oh, I'm removing a password. And then you go and test that password. Like 9 out of 10 times, it still works. Shouldn't happen. Rotate the password. Yeah. Lastly, I'm going to talk a little bit about encryption as well. Encrypt everything that you can. Think about what you have around. Do you have any domains that you have to use something like Let's Encrypt? The data that we have in Microsoft is at least, always encrypted at rest. And if you are provisioning some cloud services, some blobs, be sure that you set up the configuration. If it's already there, but don't change it, to be encrypted at rest all the time. Be sure that we have anything to ensure that the communications are encrypted in transit. And then if you have very specific cases, like some medical domain, things like this, there is even the possibility to go into encrypted at use. So it's encrypted in the RAM, even on the machine. There is things like always encrypt for SQL that does this type of things for very specific domains. And just for one extra thing, you can actually even, in some cases, bring your own key and encrypt stuff with the key that you only know.
Yeah, so speaking of encryption, it's not only relevant to security, it's also relevant to privacy. And so as partners, you may be working with customers that are in domains with like extremely sensitive protected information, like healthcare or with government organizations. And so in this case, we allow you to protect your data with your own key, with the customer's own key. And so I'm just going to quickly explain how that works and then why that is important and why that's something that you might want to onboard to. And so the way that it works usually is all of your data is in your Azure storage account, and your customer managed key is in the customer's key vault. So the key vault administrator grants access to an account that is shared between Microsoft and the customer, and when the Azure storage account needs the key, then it can request it using the managed identity. And so the customer managed key is used to encrypt the storage key that is kept alongside the data, and if we want to access the data, then we need to get access to the customer managed key to decrypt the storage key, right? So it's like a layered encryption method. And so the reason this is relevant to privacy is that Microsoft itself cannot decrypt your data without access to the customer managed key. And you can revoke access or rotate the key at any time. And so with a customer managed key, you control who has access to the data. And this is a legal requirement in many industries. And so now Business Central is offering this. And if you're in one of those industries, then you can onboard to this system. Microsoft also runs on a policy of least privileged access. And so Agustín was asking before, like, how many of you in the audience can access production resources and customer data from your own personal laptop? Well, at Microsoft, we don't do that, right? We need to take your privacy and security more seriously. And so we're only allowed to access customer data and production resources from restricted devices that are locked down in terms of the websites they can access, network requests they can make, software that can be installed. And we need to have special accounts that are only used to access these resources so that we can keep an audit trail and ensure that we grant the right access. When a Microsoft employee requests access to customer data, they need to provide a justification. And there's a select group of approvers within Microsoft who are able to grant that request. And those permissions expire after a short period of time. So as somebody who is working to resolve your support cases on the engineering side, I only have access to the things that I need for the least amount of time that I would need them. And so obviously you can see that we've made a lot of effort to protect customer data and to protect their data rights. But it is kind of Microsoft granting itself permissions, right? Obviously you can trust us, but again, in some of these sensitive industries, you might need a little bit more control over this. And so now we are offering Lockbox. Lockbox is essentially putting you, the customer, in the approval chain, right? So when a Microsoft employee requests access to data protected by Lockbox, then the customer is notified about the request, and then the customer can either approve or deny the request. So if the customer is onboarded to Lockbox, then they have the control over their data, and you can assure them that we are taking their privacy seriously. So how do we actually ensure compliance with this? Right? We can't expect everybody, particularly everybody in this room, but everybody in Microsoft, to be a privacy and security expert. And Microsoft itself has over 200,000 employees. And some of those people are project managers who often have fantastic ideas, but they often conflict with privacy and security, right? So we have an internal review process within Microsoft of several stages. So when work begins, you need to do a preliminary risk assessment, which identifies risk with the planned feature. And this review process is the same for both privacy and security. Right? When a feature is completed, we need to do a thorough review of the actual implementation, because what you actually build is often different from what you intended to build in the first place. Now that we have the AI revolution, there's a lot of specific AI requirements that need to be fulfilled as well. And then once a year, we'll do a detailed review of the whole service and every component that is involved, so that we can provide evidence to external auditors who are going to audit us for example, to grant compliance certifications or in response to security incidents. And so I just want to talk about these 3 steps today, because these are steps that are relevant to you when you're also doing engineering work. These are things that you can apply at your own companies. So the preliminary assessment, it should just be a quick meeting to identify risk with the feature, right? So as the privacy SME, usually the engineer working on the feature would come to me and present what they're going to do and explain to me how the feature works. And then I will ask, how is your personal data being handled, right? Are you sending personal data to other services, this sort of thing? What types of data are you handling? And also, in security view, you ask, what are the potential threats with this feature, right? Are you making authenticated requests with user password or tokens, this sort of thing? And so the outcome of this meeting is one of 3 things. Either, great, you're good to go. It looks like this feature is going to respect privacy and security guidelines. Or maybe, wait, this feature needs a little bit more consideration, right? Just make some small changes here and there. Maybe we'll cut this part. Or stop, this feature is in complete violation of security and privacy guidelines. And this doesn't necessarily mean that the feature is a bad idea, right? Agustín is going to talk about this a little bit later on. But often when you're dealing with privacy and security, you need to make a trade-off between usability of your feature and convenience for the engineer and the customer versus privacy and security. And you should always lean on the side of privacy and security, but obviously that means some ideas that we have, we need to turn them down because we respect your rights. And so the next step is the feature review for security. So I'll hand it back to Agustín to walk you through how this works.
Yeah, so as Ayrton was saying, this is kind of very similar between both sides. So normally what we try to do is we try to do a thorough review of the initial design of the implement. First we discuss, and then as the code is start to be created, what we ask for people is to, okay, bring a threat model, which is just basically a fancy way of like putting those threats in a way that is easy to identify risks. And then we sit down together, we identify which ones are higher priority, higher risk. We make a list of a mitigation plan. It's like, there is no way we can ship with these things. So let's go and mitigate them. And finally, when the code is ready, we will go and verify that everything is fine at this stage, right? This is kind of what it looks like a threat model. It doesn't have to be this fancy, but you can see here's things in here like Azure Storage and key vaults and SQL data warehouses. So this is the way that we will look at, because I have no idea what this feature may be, because I'm not working directly on it. The domain expert is the one that is coding this. They will create this view, and then we will sit together and kind of like, okay, what is happening in here? And we will end up with something like this, which is a list of potential risks, right? And you can see that some of them are high severity. It could be elevation of privilege. It could be a medium severity, like repudiation risks, or even denial of service. And we will pick up this list and say, okay, let's mitigate this way, mitigate this one this way, and keep them in mind before we move forward.
Yeah, so we also have the review for privacy, so I'll talk about it from my perspective. So generally what I will ask for is for somebody to produce a data flow diagram, right? So now that they've implemented the system, they should capture all of the services and the data that is flowing between them just to visualize to me and serve as an explanation for me as to what they're doing and how it works, right? They also need to create a data inventory documenting every data element and how it is handled. I'll come to that in a minute. And finally, using this evidence, I will verify whether they have met Microsoft's compliance guidelines. Right? And so if the review identifies an issue, that doesn't mean you need to cut the feature or stop or that you've wasted your time. Right? Usually it just creates some action items. For example, don't send this piece of data. Maybe you need to redirect this request to a service that's in the EU, this sort of thing. Right? And so here is an example data flow diagram. This is one that somebody drew and presented to me with the sensitive parts removed. And so you can see that I've mapped out all the services and the boundaries of those services, so whether that's geographic boundaries or boundaries between products, and captured all the data that's flowing between. And you can capture the actual specific data or just the types like customer data, user identifiable information, this sort of thing. And then we will produce the data inventory. So Microsoft needs to have evidence for all these external auditors to gain these compliance certifications. And so we very thoroughly document all of the data that is handled and exactly how it is handled. So first, we will list out all of the types of data that are handled, like your address, ID, name, etc. And then we'll capture a sample of that, because it's not always obvious from the name what is involved, right? If it's like a user object, does it contain their name or just the ID, this sort of thing? And then based on that, we can classify the data elements. So we can say, customer address, that's obviously personal data. The correlation ID that we use to correlate telemetry between services, that's just Microsoft's own system data. And then we'll capture all of the compliance-related information. So which services are storing this, which services handle it, are those services in the EU, lots of other things about third parties. And finally, we will determine for each data element, is it handled in a compliant way? And so we're not actually suggesting that you go that deep into it, right? This is obviously a very intense, time-consuming process. We need to do this because we deal with a lot of external organizations that have no understanding of how Business Central works, but they need to audit us and grant us certifications. But for you guys, the aim is just to think about privacy and security, right? So here is a data flow diagram that I drew yesterday for an example where you're just communicating with an API, right? So you can see that you authorize with the auth token and you pass the object ID of the thing that you want to retrieve, and then it returns back data that is owned by the customer, right? And this is enough.
And I came back and just wrote down a couple of things, like think about the key vault, and hey, what happens with these external services? How do they authorize, right? It's not necessary to go into this big, massive process. It's the act of thinking about these things already is a massive win.
Yeah, the intention is to stimulate a discussion about this, right? And often the feedback that you would get on something like this is, well, like let's say that your service is in the EU, but the API is in the US. Well, the auth tokens often contain personal data, right? It's just base64 encoded personal data, like your name and your email address and things like that. And so actually, you shouldn't really be sending those. You should be doing like service-to-service auth on behalf of the user. And so my suggestion would be, can you switch to service-to-service? Can we use managed identities for this? Can you not send that piece of data, please? And then finally, we have the AI feature review. Right? So Microsoft has come up with what we call the responsible AI guidelines, responsible AI principles. And so I'm just going to walk through quickly each of them. So there's accountability. So this is putting the user in control of the decisions made by the AI. Right? We don't want the AI to go rogue and start creating new sales invoices and billing your customers. We want to make sure that you know what Copilot is doing, and we need to make sure that you're the final, gate of approval before the AI takes some kind of action. Then transparency. So often the AI will come back with a response, and maybe you're thinking, well, how did it come up with this answer? Well, it needs to be explainable, and we even need to disclose that AI was used to generate this answer in the first place. Right? Then there's reliability and safety, so making sure that the feature serves a genuine purpose, not just using AI because it's fun. We're using it because we want to make people's lives easier, but also making sure that the output of the feature is consistent. So if you give the same request multiple times, it should come up with a predictable output, and monitoring and taking feedback on to make sure that we address issues that arise. Then there's fairness. We want to make sure that it's not biased. We're not making the AI based on like stereotypes. Inclusiveness. So now that we've built all of these fantastic AI features, it'd be a real shame if only a certain portion of the population could use them, right? So we need to make sure that they're accessible, that everybody is able to take advantage of these features. And finally, we come full circle to privacy and security, because now we're passing your data to the model. We're using your data to generate insights with Copilot, right? And so we need to make sure that we take your privacy and security extremely seriously. So here is an example of some of the UI from a Copilot feature that we just released. And you can see that we've shown you all of the information about how this response was generated. You have the option to edit this information, and then you have final approval. And if you don't like what you're seeing, you can always give us feedback. And this is baked into every feature that we've built. So here are some example responses from Copilot Chat, where we've applied these same principles. And it's not only in the UI, it's also when you're doing the prompt engineering and you're architecting your service on the back end. And in the next talk in the same room, we're going to talk more about that, about prompt engineering. Right? So there's going to be a lot of Copilot talks throughout the day. We're going to go into detail about the chat in a session this afternoon as well. And so if you want to learn more about responsible AI, then stick around, attend the Copilot sessions, and we'll tell you all about how to apply this in your own product. Yeah.
Awesome. So we talk about inventory, we talk about security fundamentals, some of them, there's many more, but some of the ones that we can look into after this talk. The last thing is actually thinking about the customer's perspective and what they may know about security or not know about security, but also think about the attackers. How do they actually get in, right? So some examples of that, it may be secure by default. This is something that has been talked quite a bit in the period, and it's about trying to make always, and this is a definition from the Cyber Security Center from the UK, try to make everything always as secure as it can be, all the time, without knowing it. Don't make people pay for the stuff. Make people go into settings to set it up more secure. Just make it secure first. It doesn't always happen. If you have an iPhone in your pocket and you slide from the top right corner, you can open the command center and go into airplane mode without a PIN. So if someone takes your phone, you can just set it up so it cannot talk to the internet, it cannot be located, it cannot be anything, because it will go into airplane mode unless you go and change the settings. So that is not secure by default. So if you have to choose between security and usability, what do you think? What do we go for? Yes, security. With a small asterisk, right? So obviously don't fix something that is extremely low priority and crash the usability of your application, right? It has to work, it has to be usable, but consider that trade-off, always. One more thing that I will walk very quickly. When we're thinking about phishing, think about phishing as well in a slightly different way than we used to. We are trying to look at those weird emails with long, wrong text, maybe wrong URLs and weird names. That still happens, but it's not the only thing, right? Especially now with AI, expect that those emails will become much more realistic all the time. Trust your gut. Think about what you're getting. And I don't know if you heard about spear phishing, but that's where, now with all the data that we have in the internet, with AI, someone can go and figure out that maybe you took a vacation in the Hilton hotel because you put it on Instagram, And the next thing you get is an email that says, hey, I'm from the hotel and you forgot your laptop and your iPad. Please click this link to recover it. Do you think number one is a phishing attempt? Can you do this if you think so? What about number two? Is number two a phishing attempt? Yeah, it is as well. This is a fake link, right? It's just an URL mask, right? It's exactly the same URL on the top that says anonymous fool, but just with like a URL beautification on top. This is a spoof email, which is not very difficult to get an email spoof. So if you have a good email provider, it will probably tell you something like this. But just exercise caution always. It's not that easy. Just try not to click into things. It can happen to people. It happened to even security researchers. But it's definitely a tricky one. Try to ensure that you have the right culture to avoid that. Lastly, offensive security. We have a red team in Microsoft, which are basically hackers that work for us. And they think as real attackers, right? So they come and try to break into things so we can go and fix them. But try to do the same yourself. You don't have to be, top elite hacker just to increase the security of everything you build, like tenfold, just by thinking how you will get inside. Get things like scanning websites, scan your open ports. If you're leaving open ports all over the place, be sure that you know about that. And if you have money or you have power of decision or you can influence your bosses, pay for a pen test if you can. That's a cool, very good way to also get humbled very quickly. Cool, so that's all of those things that we discussed before. So just to wrap up, I guess.
Yeah, so we've thrown a lot of information at you today, and I just want to focus on the things we expect you to take away from this conversation, right? And mostly we just want you to start thinking about privacy and security in your own organizations. And so Agustin's favorite point is create and keep an up-to-date inventory of your assets, because you can't protect the things that you don't know that you have. And once you've done this, then you should think about appointing subject matter experts, right? So you will have people in your organization who are passionate about privacy and security, and put those people in charge, right? Have those people create internal guidance and training materials for the rest of the organization, and then for every feature that you have, conduct a privacy review, right? Just have a quick conversation about the feature, what it is, how it works, what the potential threats are, and then when it's done, come back and draw a data flow diagram and think about what you're actually implemented, right? Think about the data that is being handled and the threats that are possible and how you've mitigated those risks. And finally, once you've had that conversation, actually act on the outcome, right? It's one thing to sit down and have this conversation, but then you need to go and do the work. So finally...
Yeah, I was going to say that we needed at least one AI-generated picture in the presentation. That was the previous one.
Do they have to guess which one it is?
Yeah.
So the last thing is to use AI responsibly, right? So I know that a lot of you are going to be starting to work on AI features. You're going to want to use the Copilot toolkit to build your own AI integrations of Business Central. So please go and read the responsible AI guidance and make sure that you're handling people's data with AI with respect. I attend today's sessions about how we built Business Central Copilot, where we're going to show you how to apply these principles in practice, and then go back to your job and apply the principles yourselves. So that was everything that we have to talk about. I think we have 5 minutes for questions. So
there is also a ton of extra material on the deck. So if you pick it up, there is a bunch of other of those security fundamentals that you can look into, and we'll also be around. So if you find us in the Microsoft area, just come and ask questions as well. We have time for one question or two, so if anyone wants to ask something.
And if you ask a question, then you get a free T-shirt. So.
Oh, yeah. Anyone? No?
Yes, have to stick your hand up really high if you want, because it's kind of bright up there.
No?
Cool. Maybe we confused everyone a little bit too much. A lot to take in.
Awesome. Then, yeah, it was a pleasure. Just find us around if you have any questions. And, yeah, thank you.